Welcome to our special series of Let's Talk for SLOConf, and my next guest is Navya Dwarakanath, Solutions Engineer at Catchpoint. Navya, it's great to have you on the show.
Hey Swapnil, it's really a pleasure to talk to you today. Looking forward to the conversation.
Before we get started, I would give you an opportunity to quickly tell us about Catchpoint. What are you folks all about?
Sure. So Catchpoint is a digital experience monitoring platform. With the rise in digital transformation in the industry, we've seen that a lot of organizations require visibility into the various components that deliver their application. And they need this from the perspective of their users. And that's where Catchpoint comes in. So we're into end user monitoring, and we do this using both active as well as proactive as well as reactive monitoring methodologies.
I also want to know what are the factors, what are the driver behind this rise in need for observability. Last year, because of this pandemic, what we did see was that a lot of companies, they rushed towards cloud native, they rushed to digital transformation. Now things are settling down. You can call it, the hangovers period is over now. Now is the day two, worries that are there. So talk about what are the other factors that are playing a role in this increased interest or need for observability.
Sure. So I think more or less necessity is the mother of invention, right? Observability typically was a very scientific term. It essentially meant understanding the internal goings of a system based on the external outputs. But now what's happening is, like you said, with digital transformation, there has been an increase in adoption of cloud as your data center. You're using a lot of SaaS applications in your organization. You're no longer relying on just network that you own. So essentially, if cloud is your new data center and the internet is your network, third-party providers like your CDN and your DNS become your rack and your cabinet. So that's essentially what's happening in the industry. As a result, both your operation teams, your developer teams have less visibility into what's going on in the various components that deliver your application. So less visibility essentially means less control. So when something goes wrong, you need visibility, and that has been kind of amplified into this terminology called as observability. It's gaining access and gaining visibility and hence control into components that you no longer own. And that's predominantly driven by collecting the right metrics and data along all of these components. So I think that's pretty much why we're seeing a huge rise in observability these days.
Right. I just want to go a bit deeper into observability and monitoring. You do want to know what's going on in your system. If something goes wrong, you do want to know, hey, what went wrong? But if you look at monitoring and observability, the term themselves, they simply point towards, hey, something is wrong there. But what about understandability? And then what about actually taking an action on what went wrong?
Right. So I think these things go hand in hand, right? Like even there is a huge rise in the whole actionability space, and that's why a lot of people are talking about AI ops, right? Like what are we doing with all the data that we are collecting, and that goes into the zone of actionability. And I completely agree. I think these things go hand in hand. Monitoring goes hand in hand with observability. Observability in turn goes hand in hand with actionability, and one cannot exist without the other. If you're not collecting data using monitoring, you're not observing your systems. If you're not observing your systems, you definitely cannot take action, be it manual or using machine learning algorithms on top of your data. So yeah, I think a lot of these go hand in hand and should work in parallel rather than one after the other.
Also, when we do talk about these tech trends or patterns, it's always tech and people, a social aspect. And we have already seen, the evolution, of the roles or culture or paradigms, from developer, DevOps, DevSecOps. Now we talk a lot about SRE culture. So can you also talk about in keeping kind of the discussion that we are having here, as there is a need for observability, let's talk about it from the cultural aspect as well, not purely from the technical point of view.
Sure. So one thing that definitely is happening in the industry these days is that businesses want to roll out new products. Like that is not changing. That has always been the case. But because there is complexity in rolling out new products, people are no longer rolling out releases once every 4 weeks, right? Like people are talking about micro releases every 10 minutes. So what's happening is that in a lot of organizations, the development cycles have tremendously reduced, which in turn means that you need to ensure that your developers are confident enough to like push a new feature out. Your operation team is confident in your developers that they'll not be introducing new bugs and hence compromise the reliability of your infrastructure and your applications, right? So this is where the culture aspect comes in, because you need to make sure that your developers are confident, at the same time they're accountable, and you need to make sure that your operation teams are not awake at 3 a.m. because there was a code push that was not vetted. And that is where the whole culture around SRE and DevOps is coming into play, because at the end of the day, businesses want to push out new products, deliver great user experiences, at the same time keep their employees happy, because if you don't do that, you're essentially building a really morose culture within the organization, and that in turn impacts employee productivity. And I think that is where the whole SRE culture and the evolution of SLOs as a way to drive organizations towards metrics and having data-driven decisions is extremely helpful, because now you're no longer having conversations where you're just saying, I feel that this is right, I feel that this could be wrong. You're saying this is the data and this shows that this is right, this is wrong. So I think that is where the whole SRE culture creates a happy atmosphere, at the same time helps you deliver like great products and great user experiences. So that's like the people versus the business balance that I'm seeing these days.
So true. Now let's talk about SLO. How would you kind of define the difference between SLO and SLA?
Sure. So I think because these are all SL something, like these terms get very intermingled. It's important to understand that the foundation of the whole SRE implementation starts with an SLI, which is an indicator, which is a metric. On top of it, you add some conditions around it, around time, around thresholds, and you get your service level objective. And service level objectives are not formal, they are not legal bindings. But if you take your SLO and then make that end user or customer facing and add some legal terms around it, saying that if I don't meet my SLO around availability of 98%, I'm going to give you back X hours of credit. So these are like legal terms, and if you don't abide by it, there are certain penalties. That's when you get an agreement, like a service level agreement. So that's like the biggest difference. SLOs are more internal, that is required for your own guidance, keeping things accountable within the organization, whereas SLAs are more serious and there's a legal implication to not abiding by it.
Right. And because of this, not only because of this conference, we do know the importance of SLOs. Do you have any kind of playbook or recommendations that how organizations should get started with their SLO journey?
Right. So I think that starting is like the most hard part for a lot of organizations, because everybody gets overwhelmed by the amount of information that's out there, right? Like everybody is trying to get on this whole bandwagon of implementing SLOs. I would say start small. Start with whatever you're comfortable with. SLOs have been utilized in your organizations already. You might call it KPIs, you might call it metrics, you might call it OKRs. These are things that are already available within your organization. Identify one that can be transformed into SLOs. And transformation does not necessarily mean that you have to like make major changes. It just means that the language that you start talking is slightly different. And the way you track and the way you hold people accountable to it is slightly different. So I would say start small, and then don't like plan a lot around it. Start right away with how much ever you can do, because the whole process of implementing SLOs is not a be all end all. It's not a one-time effort. It's an evolving effort that happens over a period of time. So start small, start right away, and evolve. Don't say that today I'm going to measure availability and that's it. Once I perfect it, I'm done. Don't do that. Explore different methodologies, explore new metrics that you can track, and eventually make sure that you tie it down to critical business journeys, because that's what you're eventually trying to improve.
So thanks for sharing those kind of recommendations, but you may have also seen some of the mistakes that organizations make, the pitfalls. What are those ones that they should look out for, or the mistake they should avoid?
I think the biggest mistake that a lot of organizations do is thinking that missing an SLO requires some kind of a strict action. If you read a lot of these books, they say that when you exhaust your error budget, you need to stop your releases. You're no longer, developing any features. I feel that is like one of the biggest mistakes, because SLOs are just an instrument to having data-driven conversations. It does not mean that you enforce strict rules on either your development teams or your operation teams, because that's not what you want. You are trying to establish a culture of accountability by making people look at metrics and data and using that as a way to guide business decisions. So don't use it as a strict rule, and make sure that you clearly socialize the aspects of SLOs within the organization. It should not be only specific to your development teams or your operation teams. Make sure that even business is involved, when product is involved. Make it the language that is spoken within the organization. So I think that's another thing that a lot of organizations don't do. They keep SLO as a concept that is siloed to only SREs. But if that's the case, like, you can't expect somebody to understand. And if you have an SLO breach, you can't say that, don't release features if the developers don't even know what you're talking about. So make sure that it's a common language that is spoken across, and don't make it too strict. I think those are the biggest mistakes. And it again goes back to like establishing that culture, which I believe is definitely hard, but can be done if you're following some of these guidelines.
Navya, thank you so much for taking time out today and talk about not only what Catchpoint does, but also the importance of SLOs, how to get started, and what are some of the mistakes that people make, which they should avoid. It was great talking to you. I would love to have you back on the show. So thank you for your time today.
Thank you so much, Swapnil. I think this was really great, and definitely looking forward to coming back and having another conversation with you.